Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today.
Always up for a good mental workout.
This time, we're tackling justice, a concept that's been debated, basically forever.
Right.
Our guide, Michael Sandel's book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do?
Great choice.
We'll be pulling out some juicy excerpts to really get into those tricky questions about what's fair, right?
Yeah.
And, well,
What's the right thing to do when there's no easy answer?
exactly. And trust me, Sandel doesn't shy away from tough examples. Like, think back to Hurricane Charlie in 2004. Florida gets slammed, people are desperate, and what happens? Some businesses jack up their prices like crazy.
Oh, yeah, I remember those stories.
A bag of ice, like the kind you'd get for a couple bucks, suddenly $10. Days Inn even got slapped with a $70,000 penalty for hiking up room rates.
Wow.
So is that just how the market works, or is it taking advantage of people when they're most vulnerable?
It really forces you to think about the line between, supply and demand and straight up exploitation, right?
Right. And where does our personal sense of fairness come into play?
Exactly. Sandel's book is full of these thought experiments that really challenge our gut reactions, make us question why we feel something is unfair. What principles are we basing that on?
I love that he uses these real-world examples because it's not just some abstract philosophical debate. It's stuff we've probably all encountered in some form or another.
Definitely.
Speaking of real-world dilemmas, there's this whole debate about the Purple Heart, the medal awarded to soldiers wounded in combat.
Yeah.
But what about the invisible wounds, like PTSD? Should psychological trauma count the same as a physical injury?
That's a tough one.
It is. How do we even compare those experiences? And how do we define courage and sacrifice in a way that acknowledges both the seen and unseen wounds of war?
It gets to the heart of what we value as a society, How do we honor and recognize different forms of suffering?
Absolutely. Okay, one more example before we jump into the different philosophies Sandel lays out.
Yeah.
2008, the financial crisis hits, right? Companies get bailed out with taxpayer money. But then their CEOs, the very people who steered these companies into disaster, they're still getting massive bonuses.
Yeah. I remember people being furious about that.
It felt like such a betrayal.
It did.
So is that just the system working as designed, or is there something fundamentally unjust about rewarding those who seem to have failed so spectacularly?
This example touches a nerve because it gets to the heart of fairness and accountability. Are we just propping up a system that benefits a select few no matter what?
It seems like there's this constant tension between individual rights and common good, right? Like in the hurricane example, where do we draw the line between a business owner's right to set prices and the need to protect vulnerable people?
And that's where exploring these different philosophical perspectives comes in. Sandel walks us through utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant's ideas. It's like getting a crash course in how to think about justice in a whole new way.
Okay, so let's start with utilitarianism, the whole idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Right.
Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Well, Sandel uses this really extreme example to illustrate how tricky it can get.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
The case of those shipwrecked sailors, the ones who resorted to,
Cannibalism.
yeah, to a horrifying story, but
It really sticks with you.
it does, and for good reason. They ended up, killing and eating the weakest member of the crew so the rest could survive.
I remember reading that and just being, appalled, but also kind of understanding their desperation,
Yeah, it forces you to confront this question. If their action, as horrific as it was, saved more lives, can we really condemn it? Is it morally justified from a utilitarian standpoint?
It's like a real-life trolley problem.
Exactly. And that's the core dilemma with utilitarianism. Can we truly quantify happiness? What about the rights of the individual?
Right. Does the potential happiness of the many always outweigh the suffering of the few? I mean, that feels like a dangerous path to go down.
It does raise concerns about, the tyranny of the majority and the potential for exploitation.
So utilitarianism is all about maximizing happiness, even if it means some tough choices.
Yeah.
What about libertarianism? I feel like that's on the opposite end of the spectrum.
You could say that. Libertarians are all about individual freedom, limited government intervention, free markets, personal responsibility, that kind of thing.
So in the Hurricane Charlie example, a libertarian might say those businesses had every right to raise prices, even after a disaster.
Probably. They'd argue that government price controls interfere with the free market and ultimately harm consumers in the long run.
Interesting.
They might also say, people have a responsibility to prepare for emergencies and shouldn't rely on the government to protect them from every risk.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the whole issue of inequality? If someone is born into poverty, do they really have the same opportunities as someone born into wealth?
It's a great question, and it's one that libertarians grapple with. Sandel uses the example of Michael Jordan, the basketball superstar, to illustrate this point.
Okay, how so?
Well, he asks, was Jordan's success purely due to his talent and hard work? Or did he benefit from, social structures, opportunities, maybe even some luck that others didn't have access to?
It makes you think about how much of our success is truly our own and how much is influenced by factors outside our control.
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of the debate about libertarianism. Even if we accept the premise that people own themselves, does that automatically mean they're entitled to all the rewards their talents bring? Especially if those rewards are, massively disproportionate.
Yeah, I mean, even if you believe in individual responsibility, you gotta acknowledge that the playing field isn't always level.
Absolutely. So the question becomes, how do we create a society where everyone has a fair shot, even if we don't want to completely restrict individual freedom?
I'm already seeing how each of these philosophies has its own strengths and weaknesses, its own blind spots.
That's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
Sandel isn't trying to tell us which one is right. He's showing us how each perspective illuminates different aspects of this complex idea of justice.
It's like he's giving us different lenses to look through, each one revealing something new.
Exactly.
This is fascinating.
We're just getting started. Wait till we dig into Kant and Rawls. It gets even more thought-provoking, I promise.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
All right, so moving on from focusing on consequences like with utilitarianism, let's talk about a philosopher who emphasizes duty and moral principles.
Kant.
Kant, you got it.
From what I remember, he was all about following the rules no matter what.
He definitely stressed duty and reason as the foundation of morality. But it's not as simple as just blindly following any rule, He believed that morality should be based on universal principles that we figure out using reason, not just like gut feelings or what's convenient in the moment.
So instead of focusing on outcomes like utilitarianism, he's saying our motives and the principles behind our actions, that's what really matters.
Exactly. We should act based on principles that we'd want everyone to follow, like universally. That's where his famous categorical imperative comes in.
Oh yeah, the categorical imperative. I've heard that term thrown around, but honestly, I'm still a bit fuzzy on what it actually means in practice. Like, how would that play out in a real-life situation?
Okay, imagine this. You're thinking about lying to protect a friend from someone who wants to hurt them.
Tough situation.
Right. But Kant would argue that you shouldn't lie, even then, because you wouldn't want lying to become like a universal rule everyone follows.
That's a tough one. It seems like there are times when telling the truth could lead to some pretty bad consequences.
He acknowledged that, yeah. But he believed that even though sticking to moral principles might sometimes have negative outcomes, it's still the right thing to do.
So it's about doing what's right based on principle, even if it's hard or might not have the best immediate outcome.
That's the essence of it. He was very much against basing morality on a cost-benefit analysis. It's about a sense of duty to these universal principles, regardless of the consequences.
So even if it's tough, we should strive to act in a way that we'd be okay with everyone else acting the same way.
Right. That's Kant's categorical imperative in a nutshell. He believed that this principle, this idea, could help us navigate those really tricky ethical dilemmas and make sure that our actions are grounded in reason and morality, not just, whims or personal desires.
It definitely makes you reflect on those times when you've struggled to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Kant would probably say that means you're at least trying to follow those moral principles.
He'd probably see those struggles as a sign of commitment to morality, which, is commendable in its own right.
Okay, so we've got utilitarianism focusing on outcomes, and Kant with this emphasis on duty and universal principles. What other perspectives does Sandel bring to the table?
Well, let's fast forward a few centuries and explore the work of John Rawls.
Rawls. He's the one with the veil of ignorance idea, right? I've always found that concept so intriguing.
You're right. He's the veil of ignorance guy. Rawls argued that to truly create a just society, we have to imagine designing its rules without knowing our own place in it.
Like, we don't know if we'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick, what our talents or limitations might be.
Exactly. Behind this veil of ignorance, we wouldn't be biased by our own self-interest. We'd have to choose principles that guarantee fairness and equality for everyone because, well, we wouldn't want to risk ending up on the short end of the stick.
It's like building a house where you could end up living in any room. You'd make sure every room was livable because you just don't know where you'll land.
Love that analogy. And for this thought experiment, Rawls came up with two major principles of justice.
All right, lay 'em on me. How do we build this fair society, according to Rawls?
Principle number one, everyone should have basic liberties. Freedom of speech, assembly, right to vote, the essentials.
Those seem pretty fundamental to a just society, for sure.
Absolutely. Now, the second principle, this one gets into those trickier social and economic inequalities.
So it's not just about equal opportunity, but also actively trying to, level the playing field a bit.
Precisely. Rawls argued that any inequalities that do exist, they should be structured in a way that benefits the least advantaged in society. He called this the difference principle.
So not just everyone having a fair shot, but also making sure that those who need the most help get the resources to actually succeed.
That was key for Rawls. A truly just society wouldn't just tolerate inequality, they would actively try to reduce it, work towards a fairer distribution of resources and opportunities.
I can see how this could be applied to things like universal health care or stronger social safety nets.
For sure. Rawls' work is a strong philosophical backbone for policies that aim to reduce inequality and increase social mobility.
Okay, so we've got utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant's duty-based ethics, and now Rawls with his focus on a fairer society. Where do we go from here? What other philosophical biddies does Sandel have in store for us?
Well, next up, we'll dive into a contemporary debate that really puts all these ideas to the test.
Okay, I'm ready. What's the hot topic?
Affirmative action.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Always sparks passionate arguments on both sides.
Definitely. And Sandel tackles this head-on, presenting the arguments for and against using things like race or ethnicity as a factor in college admissions or hiring.
It's like, on one hand, you have the argument that affirmative action is necessary to level the playing field, right?
Right.
For past injustices.
Right.
But then some people argue that it's discriminatory, unfair to those who don't benefit from it.
Exactly. And Sandel explores both sides. He highlights the compensatory argument, the idea that we need to right historical wrongs and provide opportunities to groups who've been systematically disadvantaged.
But there's also the diversity argument, right? The idea that a more diverse and inclusive society benefits everyone.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Proponents of affirmative action often say it creates a richer learning environment, exposes people to different perspectives. It's a win-win, they argue.
I can see the logic there. But it's hard to ignore the fact that affirmative action can feel unfair to individuals who might have been just as qualified but missed out because of these policies.
That's a valid point, and Sandel acknowledges that. He brings up those criticisms of affirmative action, the concerns about reverse discrimination, the worry that it might actually reinforce racial categories instead of breaking them down.
So does Sandel, take a stance on this? Does he offer a definitive answer?
With a lot of these ethically complex issues, Sandel doesn't try to offer a simple solution. He really wants readers to grapple with those competing arguments, weigh the different perspectives, and consider the principles at stake,
It's like he's equipping us with the tools to think critically about these issues, rather than dictating what we should believe.
Exactly. He wants us to be active participants in this ongoing debate, not just passive observers taking sides.
So far, we've covered a lot of ground: utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant, Rawls, even affirmative action. Are there any other philosophical perspectives we need to have on our radar?
Let's not forget Aristotle. He had a very different take on justice compared to the others we've discussed.
Oh, yeah. Aristotle. Always a fascinating thinker. How did he approach this whole concept of justice?
Well, unlike, say, Rawls or Kant, who are all about abstract principles and universal rules, Aristotle believed justice is about giving people what they deserve based on their merits and their role in society.
So it's not just about treating everyone equally, but about recognizing individual differences and rewarding virtue.
You got it. For Aristotle, justice wasn't just about fairness. It was about cultivating virtue and excellence within a community. And he felt that by recognizing and rewarding those who excel, those who are really good at what they do, we create a more flourishing, successful society.
Okay, I can see how that perspective could be applied to things like education or the workplace. Rewarding talent and hard work could be seen as a form of justice, right?
Absolutely. And his focus on purpose and virtue becomes really relevant when we start thinking about the role of institutions in society.
How so?
Well, Aristotle believed every institution, whether it's a family, a school, or a government, has a specific purpose, a telos. And to understand justice, we need to first grasp what that purpose is. What is that institution designed to do?
So like for a university, you could say its purpose is to promote knowledge, to cultivate critical thinking skills in its students?
Precisely. And if that's the purpose, then a just university would be one that effectively fulfills that purpose, right? By admitting students who are capable of benefiting from and contributing to that intellectual environment.
It's like saying a hammer is just if it effectively hammers nails. Its purpose dictates whether it's good or bad at its job.
Perfect analogy. Aristotle's philosophy is very grounded in the real world and how things actually function.
This has been incredibly thought-provoking, but I have to admit, I'm also a little overwhelmed by all these different perspectives. How are we supposed to make sense of all these seemingly conflicting views on justice?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And I think Sandel would say there isn't one right answer.
Yeah.
These philosophies are more like tools to help us grapple with these big moral questions, not like blueprints for building a perfect society.
So it's not about finding the one right answer, but about being part of that ongoing conversation about what justice means and how we can better achieve it.
Exactly. Sandel wants us to be actively involved in this debate, to challenge our own assumptions, to be open to different perspectives.
He's not just offering a lecture, he's inviting us into a dialogue.
Yes, and he's reminding us that achieving a just world requires all of us to participate. We need to be willing to have those tough conversations, to listen to each other, and maybe even change our minds along the way.
That's a powerful message. It makes you realize how much responsibility we all have to engage in this conversation and actively work towards creating a more just society.
And it's crucial to remember that these discussions about justice, they're not just some intellectual exercise. They have real-world implications for how we build our institutions, how we treat each other, how we create a world that's fair and equitable for everyone.
Absolutely. Speaking of real-world implications, let's talk about a topic that's particularly relevant in today's world: reparations.
Ah, yes. Sandel dedicates a whole chapter to this, exploring the moral arguments for and against compensating for past injustices.
He uses some really powerful examples, too, like reparations for the Holocaust, the Japanese internment camps during World War II, and the historical mistreatment of indigenous peoples.
Those are heavy topics, for sure.
They raise such profound questions about collective responsibility, about the lasting impact of historical wrongs.
It makes you ask, do we inherit the moral depths of previous generations? And if so, how do we even begin to address those debts in a meaningful way?
It's a really tough question.
It is. Sandel presents arguments from both sides. He discusses the concept of moral individualism, which says we're only responsible for our own actions, not the actions of others, even if those others were a part of our own family or nation.
So someone could argue they shouldn't be held accountable for what their ancestors did?
That's one side of the argument. But Sandel also brings up the counter-argument, which focuses on this idea of obligations of solidarity, the ties we have to our communities, our shared history, even if those histories are painful.
So even if we weren't personally involved in past injustices, we might still have a moral obligation to help address the consequences of those actions.
That's the argument. Sandel suggests that acknowledging and addressing historical wrongs, even if we weren't the perpetrators, is vital for creating a truly just and equitable society. And he proposes that reparations could be one way to do that.
But figuring out what those reparations should look like, who should receive them, that gets really complex and controversial.
It does. There are so many factors to consider. And Sandel doesn't shy away from those complexities. He lays out different perspectives on what would constitute adequate reparation, from financial compensation to, symbolic gestures of apology and reconciliation.
It seems like there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Each situation requires careful consideration of the specific historical context and the needs of the communities that were harmed.
Absolutely. The key takeaway from Sandel's exploration of reparations is that it's not about applying a simple formula, but about engaging in this thoughtful, nuanced dialogue about how to address past injustices in a way that promotes, genuine healing and reconciliation.
This conversation about reparations really brings the tension between individual responsibility and collective responsibility into sharp focus.
It does.
Where do we draw the line? How far back do we go when trying to right past wrongs. It feels like we're getting into some really deep philosophical waters here.
We are, and those questions lead to an even broader question that Sandel grapples with throughout the book.
Mhm.
What does it truly mean to live in a just society?
It's like all these different threads: utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant, Rawls, Aristotle, reparations. They're all woven into this intricate tapestry of what it means to create a more just and equitable world.
They are. And Sandel's book doesn't give us like a simple checklist for achieving justice.
Yeah.
Instead, it provides this framework for thinking critically about these issues, this roadmap for navigating the messy realities of those moral dilemmas.
So it's not about finding the perfect solution, but about constantly engaging in this conversation, striving to make things better, knowing there will always be more work to do.
Exactly. Sandel reminds us that justice is an ongoing process, a constant struggle to balance those competing values, those different needs and perspectives, and to create a society that, strives to be fair and equitable for everyone.
He's like, hey, here's how to think about justice. Now go out there and do the work.
Huh. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
He's empowering us to become active participants in this quest for a more just world.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of justice. It's not just about abstract theories. It's about the choices we make every day, the ways we interact with each other, the values we uphold.
It's about acknowledging the inherent dignity and worth of every person, regardless of their background, their beliefs, their circumstances.
And it's about recognizing that the pursuit of justice is a journey we take together, a journey that requires compassion, understanding, and a willingness to listen to those who might see the world differently than we do.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to flourish, to live a life of meaning and purpose.
And that's a world worth striving for, even if it means embracing the complexity, the messiness, and the ongoing challenge of figuring out what justice truly means.
Didn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive into justice, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to take away from this conversation so far?
That justice isn't some fixed endpoint we arrive at, It's an ongoing process.
An evolution.
An evolution. It requires us to be engaged, to question, to be open to new ideas and perspectives, to always be striving to make the world a little bit more just and compassionate.
And it's a process that each of us can participate in, no matter who we are or where we come from.
Absolutely. Every voice matters in this conversation. Every act of kindness, every effort to understand another's perspective, every choice we make to stand up for what we believe is right, it all contributes to creating a more just world.
Beautifully said.
So keep those thoughts in mind as you go about your day, as you interact with others, as you make decisions, big and small, because the pursuit of justice starts with each of us, right here, right now.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us for this first part of our exploration of justice. We've got so much more to cover, so make sure to tune in next time as we continue our deep dive into Michael Sandel's thought-provoking work.
Looking forward to it.
We'll pick up right where we left off, delving deeper into specific dilemmas and exploring even more philosophical frameworks.
And who knows, maybe we'll even uncover some answers along the way.
Or at least some really good questions.
That's the goal.
Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more just world. We'll see you soon.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into justice. Last time, we left off with a whole bunch of questions about, individual rights, the common good, those big philosophical frameworks.
Utilitarianism, libertarianism, yeah.
We were just getting started, and things are about to get even more interesting as we explore some more specific dilemmas and those, gray areas where there's no easy right or wrong answer.
Exactly.
So where do we pick up? What other thought-provoking nuggets does Sandel have in store for us?
Well, remember how we talked about those obligations of solidarity, those ties we have to our communities and our shared history, even the parts that are, uncomfortable or painful?
Yeah, it was in the context of reparations, right? The idea that we might have a moral obligation to address past injustices, even if we weren't personally involved.
Exactly. And Sandel takes that idea a step further and argues that it has implications for how we think about justice in a broader sense, beyond just specific historical wrongs. Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this idea of solidarity connect to the bigger picture of justice?
Well, he suggests that true justice might require us to think beyond just individual rights and consider the needs of the community as a whole.
So it's not just about me and what I'm entitled to, but about us and what we owe to each other as members of a society.
Exactly. It's like, even if I have a right to something, maybe there are times when I should choose not to exercise that right if it would harm the community or go against the common good.
That's interesting. Can you give me an example of how that might play out in real life?
Sure. Think about something like wearing masks during a pandemic.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Right. From a purely individualistic perspective, I might say, hey, it's my body, my choice. I have the right to decide whether or not I wear a mask.
Right.
But Sandel would argue that even though you might technically have that right, there's also this obligation to consider the well-being of others.
Like how wearing a mask, even if it's a minor inconvenience for me, could help protect vulnerable people in my community.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our actions, even seemingly personal ones, can have a ripple effect on those around us. And that sometimes justice means putting the needs of the community ahead of our own individual desires.
That makes me think about all the debates we've had in recent years about things like vaccine mandates or social distancing measures.
For sure, those debates often get framed as individual freedom versus government overreach, right? But Sandel's point is that it's not that simple.
There's also this moral dimension, this obligation we have to each other as members of a shared society.
Exactly. It's like, yes, we should value individual liberty, but we also need to acknowledge that we don't exist in a vacuum. Our actions have consequences, and sometimes justice requires us to make sacrifices for the greater good.
This idea of solidarity is really powerful. It makes you think about the ways we're all interconnected and how our choices can impact the well-being of others, sometimes in ways we might not even realize.
It's like even those seemingly personal decisions, they could be tied to these broader questions of justice and the common good. It's all connected.
This is making my brain hurt in a good way.
It's good brain food.
It is. So where does Sandel go from here? How does he tie all these threads together, all these different perspectives on justice, these complex dilemmas, this idea of solidarity?
Well, he doesn't offer a neat and tidy conclusion, you know? He's not trying to give us a definitive answer to the question of what justice is.
Makes sense. There probably isn't one right answer that applies to every situation.
Exactly. Instead, he encourages us to keep wrestling with these questions, to keep engaging in this ongoing conversation about what it means to create a more just and equitable world.
So it's about embracing the complexity, the messiness, and realizing that the pursuit of justice is a never-ending journey.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about being willing to challenge our own assumptions, to listen to different perspectives, and to keep striving to make the world a little bit better, a little bit more just, even if it's just one small step at a time.
It sounds like Sandel is saying that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of justice.
Absolutely. He's reminding us that it's not just about philosophers and academics debating these ideas in ivory towers. It's about all of us, making choices in our daily lives, engaging in our communities, speaking up for what we believe in.
It's about taking those philosophical ideas and putting them into action.
Exactly. Because the pursuit of justice, it's not a spectator sport. It requires all of us to get in the game.
I love that. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant, Rawls, Aristotle, affirmative action, reparations, this idea of solidarity and the common good. It's a lot to process.
It is. But I think Sandel's book does a brilliant job of making these complex ideas accessible and relevant to our everyday lives.
He's like the ultimate guide to navigating the moral maze of the 21st century.
I like that analogy. He gives us the tools and the frameworks to think critically about these issues, to engage in meaningful conversations, and to make informed decisions that align with our values.
It's like he's saying, here's how to think about justice, now go out there and do the work.
Exactly. And that work can take many forms, right? It can be volunteering in our communities, advocating for policies that promote equality, having those tough conversations with friends and family, or simply striving to be more just and compassionate in our own interactions with others.
It's about realizing that the pursuit of justice is not some distant goal. It's something we can embody in our everyday lives.
And it's a journey we take together, constantly learning, evolving, and striving to create a world that reflects our highest ideals.
Beautifully said. Well, as we wrap up this second part of our deep dive into justice, what's the one key takeaway you'd like our listeners to ponder as they continue on this journey with us?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think I'd want them to consider this. What does justice look like in your own life? What are those specific actions, big or small, that you can take to make your corner of the world a little bit more just and equitable?
It's a call to action. It's about taking those philosophical ideas and making them personal, making them real.
Exactly, because the pursuit of justice, it starts with each of us, right here, right now. And every step we take, no matter how small, it makes a difference.
I love that. So to our listeners, we'll leave you with that thought-provoking question as we head into our final part of this deep dive. Get ready for some more mind-bending discussions as we explore even more complex dilemmas and grapple with the ever-evolving nature of justice.
Can't wait.
We'll see you there. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into justice. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant, Rawls, Aristotle, you name it.
And let's not forget those real-world dilemmas, affirmative action, reparations, those obligations of solidarity.
It's been a whirlwind tour of the entire history of philosophical thought on justice.
It has.
So as we wrap things up, I'm curious, what are some of the big takeaways that stand out to you? What's stuck with you as we've explored all these different perspectives?
Well, I think what's really resonated with me is how these philosophies, they highlight the inherent tension in our pursuit of justice. There's this constant push and pull between competing values.
Like we were saying earlier, individual rights versus the common good.
Exactly. We have utilitarianism, which aims for the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but it sometimes risks sacrificing the rights of the individual.
And then there's libertarianism, which is all about individual freedom and limited government, but it sometimes struggles to address those systemic inequalities that prevent everyone from having a truly fair shot.
And then you have Kant, with his emphasis on moral principles and duty. It's a powerful idea, but it can feel a bit rigid in certain situations,
What about those times when following the rules might actually lead to a worse outcome? It makes you wonder if there's ever a time when bending the rules or even breaking them might be the more just thing to do.
Yeah, it's a tough question. And then there's Rawls with his veil of ignorance and those principles of a just society.
Yeah, his ideas are so compelling, but translating those abstract principles into real-world policies, that's a whole other challenge.
It is.
Yeah.
And let's not forget Aristotle, who brings in this whole idea of purpose and virtue. But his views also raise questions about who gets to define those things, Who decides what constitutes excellence and what roles people should play in society.
It seems like each of these philosophies offers a piece of the puzzle, but putting those pieces together, figuring out how they all fit, that's where it gets really tricky.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what Sandel's trying to do. He's not giving us a simple answer. He's showing us how complex this idea of justice really is.
It's like he's saying, look, there's no magic formula. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right? He's encouraging us to embrace the messiness, the gray areas, to recognize that justice isn't about finding the perfect answer, but about engaging in this constant process of debate and deliberation.
It's like he's giving us a toolkit, equipping us with these different lenses to view the world and saying, okay, now go out there and figure out what justice means in your own lives, in your communities, in the world around you.
I love that analogy. He's empowering us to become active participants in this ongoing conversation about justice, rather than just passive observers.
It's a call to action. He's reminding us that we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable world.
And that role can take many forms, right? It can be advocating for policy changes, volunteering in our communities, having those tough conversations with friends and family, or simply striving to be more just and compassionate in our own daily interactions.
It's about recognizing that justice isn't some far-off destination. It's a journey we're all on together.
And that journey requires us to be engaged, to be open-minded, to be willing to listen and learn from each other, even when we disagree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into justice, what's the one key question you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something for them to ponder as they continue this journey.
That's a good one. I think I'd ask them to consider this. What does a just world look like to you? What are the values, the principles, the actions that you believe are essential for creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, to live a life of dignity and meaning?
That's a powerful question. It challenges us to not just passively consume these ideas, but to actively engage with them, to make them our own.
Exactly. Because ultimately, the pursuit of justice begins with each of us, with our own individual choices and actions.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving for a more just and compassionate world. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. It's a journey we're all on together.
Beautifully said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into justice. We hope you found it thought-provoking, inspiring, and maybe even a little bit challenging.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep diving deep.